shaking. Are you okay? Wake up.
If you're a fan of the Elder Scrolls, you're probably familiar with the rumour that its third entry, Morrowind, was written by one developer on a sleepless binge of magic mushrooms and LSD. It is a funny story, and considering how bonkers the world of Morrowind is, it's a rumour that's become inseparable from the game's online discussion. Only problem is, it's all a bunch of hooey. Sure, Bethesda might be on drugs when they're doing their QA testing, but in the case of Morrowind, much of its lore was actually written under the straight-laced combo of cigarettes, coffee, and bourbon. Since Morrowind's release in 2002, there's been a wealth of information made available regarding its development. What worked, what didn't, and most importantly to this video, what inspired the game's unforgettable visual aesthetic and in-game writings. Because despite what the internet might say, Morrowind's alien landscapes, whimsical architecture, and intricately detailed spirituality didn't just come out the end of a skooma pipe. It came from a knowledge of real-world ancient cultures, the study of esoteric religions, a love for unique works of pop culture, and the terrific imagination of Bethesda's writers and artists. I don't want to understate just how much of Morrowind borrows from real-world history, but since I'm not a theology professor or an anthropologist, this video will be focused on the contemporary media side of things. The books, comics, movies, tabletop RPGs, and video games that influenced or inspired the many people who created such a memorable world. The man at the center of this video, and the LSD meme, is Michael Kirkbride, a writer and concept artist who left Bethesda before Morrowind was even released. By all accounts, Kirkbride was the man most responsible for steering the third Elder Scrolls away from typical European high fantasy and into something far more bizarre and culturally ambiguous. That's not to downplay the efforts of his very talented co-workers, but as the most outspoken member of the original team, Kirkbride's quotes will be the main point of reference for most, but not all, of the media we'll be looking at. I'll also be chucking a few of my own sensible theories into the mix as well. Bits of media that have never been outright confirmed to be an influence over Morrowind, but share enough significant similarities to warrant a closer look. So crack open a Kwama egg, smoke that moon sugar, and settle in as we take a look at the artistic inspirations behind Morrowind. First, let's address the sandworm in the room, Frank Herbert's Dune. Dune is everywhere in Morrowind, from the exotic landscapes and political intrigue, to the core narrative and sci-fi meets fantasy visual makeup. It's been mentioned in the game's interviews, oral histories, and post-mortems more than any other piece of fiction, which makes it our first confirmed media influence. Since it was first published in 1965, the adventures of young Paul Atreides have come to us in many forms. But according to Michael Kirkbride, nothing is more sacred or influential to his own art than David Lynch's incredibly divisive film adaptation from 1984. As much as I enjoy it, Lynch's Dune is a very messy movie that's borderline incomprehensible if you haven't read the book. And in all fairness, studio meddling and the scope of the source material were definitely large factors in its commercial and critical failure. Because you can't just hire the guy that made Eraserhead, ask him to adapt an incredibly dense novel, then expect Star Wars to come out the other end. Still, a redeeming quality just about everyone can agree on is the originality of the film's visuals. Lynch's Dune takes a large amount of very memorable creative liberties with the source material, and through Michael Kirkbride, a few of those have made their way into the Elder Scrolls. A quick look at Lynch's version of the Fremen stillsuits alongside Morrowind's Dark Brotherhood armor should speak for itself. And while they may not be as disturbing, I do see a bit of Lynch's penis-vagina monsters in the floating bull netches. According to both Todd Howard and Michael Kirkbride, Lynch's version of The Voice would even find its way into Skyrim in the form of dragon shouts.
You mustn't speak!
But despite the shadow of David Lynch and Frank Herbert hanging over Vardenfell, Kirkbride maintains that while Dune certainly had an influence on the game's art, its actual story didn't have much bearing on Morrowind's development. Now, far be it from me to dispute the man who actually wrote and designed so much of the thing, but I'm not entirely convinced. While both tales borrow from various messiah myths, it's just a little too easy to draw very specific comparisons between the two. Both stories take place in a hotly disputed alien world, where natives ride giant creatures and great houses wrestle for control under the thumb of a foreign empire. In the shadows, a nomadic indigenous people bum around waiting for a messiah to come and drive out the invaders. And when that messiah does come, there's a great deal of ambiguity as to whether or not this hero is really a divine chosen one or just a guy playing the role that various political forces have laid out for him. Just as Paul drinks the water of life to unlock crazy visions and metaphysical insight, so too does the Nerevarine become immune to all disease after drinking the Corpus cure. The sleepers awaken! And at the end of it all, the Nerevarine ends Vardenfell's Blightstorms, and in Lynch's Dune, Paul ends the drought on Arrakis. There's far more meat to both stories, and I'd never say that Morrowind is just Dune with racist elves, but it's a natural comparison to make considering the team's love for that world.
Shield practice? Gurney, we had practice this morning. I'm not in the mood.
Not in the mood. Mood's a thing for cattle and love play, not fighting.
I'm sorry, Gurney.
Not sorry enough.
In a very roundabout kind of way, I have a feeling that Dune has even influenced Kirkbride's work as a visual artist. Here are some lovely sketches from Morrowind's art book showing the bold new direction that he was pushing the Elder Scrolls in. It's a far cry from the Frank Frazetta Dungeons & Dragons look of Daggerfall, but besides the obvious desert backgrounds, there isn't much here that immediately screams Dune. Those who know their comic book history might know where I'm going with this. These sketches bring to mind the work of French comic artist Jean Giraud, better known under his pen name Moebius. Emerging out of the French comic scene of the 1960s, Moebius is best known for his transgressive series like Blueberry, Arzac, and The Incal, many of which were serialized in the seminal French anthology magazine Médor. Despite creating a fairly diverse range of comics across fantasy, sci-fi, and western settings, Giraud's most recognizable panels are typically exemplified by surreal arid settings, crowded multi-species cities, huge rideable creatures, and strangely colored humanoids clad in very ornate armor or ceremonial get-ups. Sound familiar? He might not be a household name outside of France, but Giraud's influence is so far-reaching that he likely has his fingerprints over a piece of media that you just can't live without. And if that sounds a little over the top, just ask one of his many fans. In the mid-70s, Giraud would join a dream team of artists led by maniac Chilean director Alejandro Jodorowsky. Their mission? A film adaptation of Dune that would bring the hallucinations of an acid trip out of the mind and onto the big screen. Our man Moebius would contribute around 3,000 character designs, landscapes, and storyboards to the project, which would eventually crash and burn after 2 years of intense pre-production. Surviving material would quietly make its way around the industry behind closed doors and greatly influence many who came across it. Here's some of the leftover concept art for Jodorowsky's Dune. Now wouldn't it be nice if we let some of Kirkbride's concept art just hang out with them? See what I mean? So while Kirkbride has never publicly mentioned Moebius as an influence, I think it's fair to say that as a trained artist and big-time sci-fi nerd, there's a good chance that he's familiar with Giraud's work. For this reason, I'm giving Moebius a more than likely rating. Speaking of Dune-inspired, how about a little Star Wars? In Polygon's oral history of Morrowind, Star Wars is mentioned as both a genuine influence over the game and as a way to Trojan horse some of Kirkbride's nuttier ideas past Todd Howard, saying, "The easiest way to get anything past Todd at that time was you basically just had to say Star Wars, which was true for me and anybody then. So I was like, the game should be like Dark Crystal meets Star Wars," and he was immediately hooked. Despite the bait and switch, Kirkbride's love of Star Wars clearly comes from a genuine place, considering how often he's referenced the franchise as a core part of Morrowind's aesthetic. As a fantasy RPG filled with elves and swords, the stormtroopers and lightsabers of Star Wars might seem like they have little in common with the Elder Scrolls. For a while I struggled to connect these dots myself, but after a lot of wandering around the sandier parts of Vvardenfell, I do see the impression Big George has left on the final game. Both worlds feel very dusty and worn out, with the technology of these settings feeling oddly opposed to the very ancient abodes these people inhabit. I see Luke Skywalker's igloo in the houses of Old Run, and a little Jabba's palace in the rounded tops of Velothi-style architecture. Tatooine has 2 suns, so Nirn has 2 moons, and the earth-toned, multicultural hive of Balmora could be right down the road from a place like Mos Eisley. Just take out all the droids and stormtroopers, and you could very easily picture some grouchy Dunmer living in a place like this.
You Enwa!
And I'm sure the Commander Tong of the Balmora Council Club would fit right in with the grotty fellas of Mos Eisley Cantina. The influence of George Lucas isn't as obvious as that of Frank Herbert, but it's here nonetheless, and I'm sure Morrowind would feel like a very different place if Kirkbride was more of a Trekkie than a Star Wars fan.
It's the Muppet Show with our very special guest star, Mr. Don Knotts!
Sometimes it feels like the Muppets have seen and done it all. They've been to space, taken Manhattan, found Treasure Island, and of course, saved Christmas. With such an impressive resume, it's a shame they've never taken Tamriel with the Muppets in Morrowind, but until that day comes, Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal will have to do for now. Released in 1982 when much of Bethesda would have been around 12 years old, the crumbling old world of The Dark Crystal seemed to have quite an impact on Morrowind's earliest drafts. Going back a bit further, we can even see the Dark Crystal's influence over Morrowind's often forgotten predecessor, Redguard. It's also already been mentioned in this very video, which makes the Dark Crystal our 3rd confirmed influence. As a Muppet-adjacent project, it is a family-friendly movie, but only in the old school sense, back when family movies weren't afraid to scare the bejesus out of you. Set in a once fantastical world ruined by the breaking of its all-powerful crystal, our hero Jen, the Gelfling, journeys out to stop the evil Skeksis from using the remnants of the crystal to rule the planet. While the story isn't exactly 3rd era Tamriel, the Dark Crystal's aesthetic similarities to Morrowind begin right from the very first shot with the silhouette of a very Telvanni looking castle. The mossy, weed-covered ruins of an ancient people existing right alongside dirty little homes and cubbyholes filled with odd creatures is very much Morrowind. I could see my own ugly elf character pottering around this realm for hours, meeting funny creatures and getting lost from unhelpful quest directions. Vvardenfell's Ashlanders would find themselves right at home with the Dark Crystal's mystics too. It's not every day you find another group that loves tattered robes, hanging doodads, and living in the desert as much as you do. And if you really want one completely unambiguous influence to point out, look no further than Dark Crystal's Landstriders and their similarity to Morrowind's Siltstriders. Come on, Michael. Even Stevie Wonder could see where you got that idea from. I think a shared influence between these two works could also be found in the fantasy art of Roger Dean. The man certainly loved his funny mushroom buildings, and I wouldn't be surprised if that passion rubbed off on both Jim Henson and the team at Bethesda. And if you'd like to play an RPG with even heavier Dark Crystal aesthetics, you'd do well to check out Final Fantasy IX. A classic JRPG with a whimsical storybook setting that was partly inspired by the Dark Crystal and many other family-friendly dark fantasy movies from the 80s. So far we've been discussing a lot of Western influences, and considering Morrowind was created by a group of D&D playing, Star Wars watching American dudes born long before anime became a mainstream Western phenomenon, that makes sense. But hidden amongst the monster manuals and Jar Jar Binks figures, there seems to have been at least one committed otaku over in the Maryland offices. Environmental artist Mark Bullock. In an interview with Eurogamer, Bullock pulls out the usual inspirations like Star Wars and the Dark Crystal, but makes sure to mention Studio Ghibli director Hayao Miyazaki in all caps for extra emphasis. And in a 2001 developer diary, Bullock specifically references pulling out his anime for the creation of some of Morrowind's geometry and textures. Now I too love to pull out my anime from time to time, so all I can say is, thank God I found you, Mark Bullock, because now we can talk about 1982's Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. In an overgrown, post-apocalyptic future, the movie sees Princess Nausicaa from the peaceful Valley of the Wind wrapped up in a conflict with an evil empire looking to violently cleanse the planet of its mutated ecosystem. Nausicaa's world is one of toxic jungles, flying creatures, building-sized mushrooms, and telepathic insects where humans do their best to eke out a quiet life in simple tribes and villages. Much like Vardenfell's Dunmer, Nausicaa's tribe has a deep mythology based on the hostile environment that surrounds them. While the Empire aims to eradicate the ecosystem completely, Nausicaa's people look to better understand their place within it. Those fungal forests and their many critters wouldn't feel out of place in Kirkbride's Vardenfell. And at the end of it all, Nausicaa's big baddie is the reconstruction of an ancient fleshy mech, just like Dagoth Ur and his DIY machine god, Akula Khan. Despite Bullock's quote about Miyazaki, and Morrowind having its own literal Valley of the Wind, I'll admit that Nausicaa's potential influence over the game isn't as concrete as some of the media we've already gone over. Maybe Bullock wasn't talking about Nausicaa at all, and instead Morrowind was deeply shaped by My Neighbor Totoro. But considering two of Nausicaa's largest influences are also two of Morrowind's largest influences, and how often I've seen it compared to Morrowind online, this video just wouldn't feel complete without giving Nausicaa a sensible nod for acknowledgement's sake. You wouldn't have Nausicaa without Dune or Moebius, so it's entirely possible that its similarities to Morrowind are just a case of Bethesda pulling from the same well of inspiration that Miyazaki did. With all that in mind, I'm very diplomatically giving Nausicaa a "I think I'm onto something" kind of rating, with a side note that you should all go watch it or read the manga as homework. It's great. And just as I recommended FF9 for fans of the Dark Crystal, so too would I recommend the original Panzer Dragoon to friends of Nausicaa, a rail shooter set in a Dune meets Nausicaa setting with art and design courtesy of our beloved homeboy, Moebius. Whew, that's enough about movies, books, and comics for a while, so what about games? Well, according to Kirkbride, there's two very specific titles that played a large role in moulding his personal aesthetic. And hold on to your hats, because they aren't RPGs, they're 2D platformers. 1991's Another World and 1997's Oddworld, Abe's Oddysee, not only shaped Morrowind, but also platformers in general. Today we might think of them as early examples of the cinematic platformer subgenre, since they're mostly appreciated for their set-piece moments, detailed animations, and greater artistic ambitions. The first few screens of Another World should tell you everything about its relation to Morrowind. A dry and lonely landscape, 2 imposing moons, scary wildlife, and an unmistakable debt to the man we just can't get away from, Moebius. Another World is a bit more sci-fi than fantasy, but that doesn't disqualify it considering Kirkbride himself sees Morrowind as a sci-fi fantasy hybrid. But if I had to weigh one game's influence over the other, I do think Abe's Oddysee played the larger role here.
Hello.
Oddworld's first entry is the story of Abe, a clumsy green janitor who works at a meat factory run by the evil industrialist Gluckons. After the Gluckons hatch a plan to turn Abe's species into meat popsicles, Abe breaks loose and embarks on a journey to liberate his people. Just like Another World, Abe's Oddysee is crushingly difficult, and I could see a good chunk of casual players never making it out of that first factory area. Which is a shame, because outside of Rupture Farms is where Oddworld's influence over Morrowind very clearly begins. Oddworld's unfettered wilderness is crawling with nasty creatures and weird bugs that surely lit up Kirkbride's imagination when designing much of Vardenfell's wildlife. As a result, Morrowind's prehistoric monsters and primordial creatures are practically from another planet compared to Daggerfall's more traditional high fantasy lineup. Even some of the names for these guys sound straight out of Oddworld. Would you rather have a Netch, Scrib, or Gwar as a pet, or are you more of a Slig, Scrab, and Slog kind of person? Let me know. Oddworld's reliance on pre-rendered backgrounds allowed its team to go bananas with visual details. That setting of earthy temples and vine-covered hollows is a real showcase for what could be done with static backgrounds. So it's a testament to Bethesda's artists that they were able to translate aspects of that aesthetic into a massive 3D world. Those later 3D games can be very hit or miss, so seeing crumbs of Oddworld show up in the swamps and ruins of Vardenfell does help to ease the pain a little. In 1996, Ken Rolston, Kurt Coleman, and Michael Kirkbride would join Bethesda, and with Daggerfall finally out the door, the new fellas would bond over a variety of weird sci-fi books and tabletop games as they mulled over which direction to take the next Elder Scrolls in. One of these shared passions was the works of fantasy author Gene Wolfe, and the other was Greg Stafford's Glorantha, a sprawling and intricately detailed fantasy world that served as the setting for various tabletop games like Runequest. Rolston himself had worked extensively on Runequest for many years, and when it came time to direct Morrowind, the world of Glorantha was clearly at the front of his mind, saying, Tamriel was largely inspired by Glorantha, the world of Runequest, an influence that was a little overwhelming, by the way. Trying to wrap my head around Glorantha has been a bit of a pickle for me. I don't play tabletop games anymore, and it would be a pretty big ask for me to call up my friends for multiple sessions of something called Runequest. But after poring over every era-appropriate guidebook I could get my little mitts on, here's what I've noticed. By and large, Glorantha did not influence the visual aesthetics of Morrowind. Glorantha is very much a world of swords and sorcery, with its muscle-bound men and serpentine monsters, cheeky green goblins and wise old wizards, sorcerers and genies, and boobies in bikinis. Instead, Glorantha's similarities to Morrowind lie more in how it tackled its world building. There's a big focus on the myths and politics of all its various factions, cults, and races. Up above, we have a massive pantheon of very detailed gods, and much like Morrowind, there's an emphasis on the metaphysical and transcendent that definitely shaped some of the weirder spiritual concepts like Chim. And while it's true Tamriel still had religion long before Kirkbride and Rolston arrived on the scene, I think their shared love of Glorantha and Kirkbride's study of comparative religion in college are really what pushed these spiritual aspects to the front of the third entry. Interestingly, when development began on Oblivion, Rolston was keen to tone down much of Glorantha's influence, saying, Oblivion has turned its back on Glorantha's eccentricity and graphic elegance to refocus on tropes of a more standard fantasy genre, Tolkien or D&D style. I'm sure the man had his reasons, and in some ways it definitely is a bummer, but when Oblivion has such a lovely green aesthetic of its own, and all the old weirdness still had an outlet in the Shivering Isles, personally, I'm not too bothered by it.
Wonderful! Time for a celebration! Cheese for everyone!
Strangely enough, I don't think many computer RPGs of the era had much of an impact on Morrowind's aesthetic. By 2002, there were plenty of big-name PC RPGs that strayed from the typical high fantasy setting, but very few were as outlandish as what we'd see in Morrowind. The heavy hitters of Morrowind's day could still fit nicely under labels like cyberpunk, steampunk, or post-apocalyptic. And over 20 years later, there still aren't many RPGs that escape classification quite like Morrowind does. But if I really had to pick one computer RPG that possibly left a mark on Morrowind, I think you could make a decent case for Black Isle's Planescape Torment. Set in the grimy multiverse city of Sigil, you play as the Nameless One, a heavily scarred, tattoo-covered man who could never die and has no memories of his past life. It's the best amnesia story since Dude, Where's My Car, and a high watermark for game writing in general, courtesy of Chris Avallone. With a multiverse setting that encompasses a ton of different D&D worlds, Planescape's aesthetic is understandably all over the shop. Still, one unifying aspect of this fairly anything-goes sort of look is a very creative mishmash of ancient cultures. That fantasy hodgepodge of contrasting historical influences is a quality you'll also find in Morrowind, with Todd Howard and Michael Kirkbride specifically citing Egyptian, Middle Eastern and early Japanese cultures as a foundation for Vardenfell's visual character. And if some of Morrowind's key players wandered into Sigil, I think they'd fit right in thanks to how diverse and strange both settings are. Despite being the shittiest part of the game, I think the town of Cursed bears a good resemblance to some of Morrowind's Dwemer areas, especially the ruins around Red Mountain. They share that same cracked earth look, where great big steampunk ruins litter the surface of a place that may as well be on Mars. Oh, I could go on and on about broad similarities or how both titles took bold risks with a fantasy setting, but I think it's easier to just say both games are deeply weird PC RPGs with a one-of-a-kind setting and lots of reading. If you're into the far-out mysticism of Morrowind's in-game books, then Planescape's never-ending walls of completely mental text and interactive lectures should be right up your alley. And if you can stand Morrowind's combat, then you'll be well prepared for Planescape's crummy little fights. While Planescape has never been mentioned as a direct inspiration, we do know that Ken Ralston and programmer Eric Parker were certainly big fans of it. Like Nausicaa or Moebius, it would have been a waste to just ignore this one. And even if Planescape didn't influence Morrowind at all, they're two games that are often mentioned in the same breath, united by an exotic and literary quality you won't find in too many other titles. So with all this in mind, I'm giving Planescape a maybe not rating. At the very least, I hope this has motivated you to go out and play or replay it for yourself. Because if you're a fan of story-heavy games, you just cannot afford to skip this one.
Hey, Chief, you okay? You playing corpse or you putting the blinds on the dusties? I thought you were a deader for sure.
So there you have it. Everything I could dig up about Morrowind's influences, plus a few theories of my own. If your introduction to Bethesda was through a more modern title like Skyrim or Fallout, then Morrowind is probably a game you like the look of and wish you could get into, but find too dated or intimidating to enjoy. Well, to that I say, baloney. This is not some arcane or impenetrable experience. It's a game that sold over 4 million copies, and for better or worse, is still a bit of a tentpole when it comes to open-world RPG design. When you enjoy any of those newer Bethesda games, you're still playing around with the bones of Morrowind. I know it can be tough to get into. The combat stinks, I don't like the stamina system, the journal gives bad directions, and conversations can feel like reading Wikipedia. But if you can learn to live with its rough edges, you'll find a very endearing game with a one-of-a-kind atmosphere. So drink your stamina potions, make some ridiculous spells, and just let Vardenfell wash over you. I won't lie, speculating about the creative process of a game from over 2 decades ago has been a little stressful. What if someone like Michael Kirkbride was to see this video and shoot down all of my theories to set the record straight? Would that be embarrassing, and would it invalidate all the ideas I've thrown into the mix? Weirdly, I don't think it would. Because art is not some kind of puzzle to be solved. Creators always have their own intentions and inspirations, but that doesn't mean that we as the audience can't discuss what we see as similarities or wonder what those influences were. At the very least, I hope this video has introduced you to something you thought looked cool or interesting. And whether they're true or not, I'm looking forward to reading any comments people might leave about what they think inspired Morrowind. So for all those reasons, I'm happy to be wrong, as long as we've all had fun talking about it. And hey, if you really want to get into it, appreciating the Elder Scrolls in a way the creators never intended does feel pretty true to the spirit of this franchise.